being here. We have an interesting panel today, a topic that I think is going to engender some interesting conversation around technology and why is our industry slow on adopting it. Maybe I would put my own 2 cents in and say appears slow or perceived to be slow on adopting new technology. Since I've already been introduced, let me introduce the members of the panel we have here today. Immediately to my left is Curtis Carson. Curtis is the head of research and technology, industrial strategy and systems for Airbus. Next to Curtis, we have Dan Murphy, who is responsible for project development in the Middle East for Alcoa. Next to him is Sami Issa, who is the general manager for Cognite. Following down the line is Amir Siddiqui, who is the chief financial officer of Strata. Peter Smith, who is the chairman and CEO of the Naismith Group. And at the end, we have Dr. Astush Moitra, who is the chief engineer of Spike Aerospace. So thank you, panel, for being here today. And I guess I'm going to start with the question that is on my mind. Given the aerospace industry has given so many new products to the world, Velcro, the microwave, light-scale composites, and the fact that these products have been used, composites back in the 50s on the 707 and 3D printing in the 80s in the prototype shops. Why is it that we're perceived as having a slow take-up on technology? And maybe start the discussion. Amir, maybe I can ask you to comment first.
Sure, thanks. Look, I think we need to put things into perspective and ask ourselves 2 questions. That is the industry really slow? We need to ask ourselves whether are we talking about the same industry, which industry are we referring it to, and more importantly, which product are we referring to? For example, let's take the mobile phone industry. A lot of innovation, a lot of technology, similar to the aerospace industry. But if you look at the product life cycle, you have a new iPhone out every six months or 12 months. So if you compare it to that industry, you can argue and say, well, yes, it is slow. But then compare the product and the product life cycle of the products we manufacture, which is aircrafts, and they fly for 30 years, if not more. So considering these 2 factors, one needs to make an opinion of whether it's slow or not. I think another important aspect is we come from a very highly regulated industry. There's a lot of testing done, certification and qualification processes that any new technology goes through before it's launched. And I'm not saying for a second that other industries aren't regulated, but we're that notch further high up. You can always turn off your mobile phone or take the battery out and reset it if something goes wrong, but you can't do that on an aircraft that's at 40,000 feet. So considering the 3 factors about the industry, the product life cycle, and the rigorous testing and qualifications that we go through, I personally don't think that we're slow in introducing new technology at all. We're more prudent, but we're not slow.
Anybody else care to comment on your views on this perception we have in the industry?
Sure, John, thanks. It's interesting, if you think back to Mark Stuckey this morning when he was talking about the flight test regime, what did he start with? He started with materials. Mm-hmm. And so from a material manufacturing perspective, I would say we're absolutely not slow in adopting technology. There are just factors when you do that. And one of the factors is how many on-ramps do you have for new material in a platform? You either have a new design or you have some drop-in opportunities along the way, incremental upgrades that Mark Allen kind of talked about from Boeing. To be sure, in Alcoa we target both, but they are somewhat limiting in when you can introduce new materials. I'd use the Airbus example of the A320. Sometimes changes in an airframe are not quite visible to the general public, which leads to the perception, I think. If you look at the engine on the 320neo, our collaboration with Pratt & Whitney produced the first ever forged aluminum lithium fan blade. It's 10% lighter, thinner, more aerodynamic, and lower cost than the composite alternative, but not generally known to the public. And certainly that's, feeds the perception. So while that's interesting that we collaborated with Pratt to do that and introduce new technology, there's a couple other things we had to do as a manufacturer, and that is make sure we had the robust supply chain in place to produce that aluminum lithium material, and Airbus is a good example of using it in structure as well. So right from the beginning in our R&D center, we had to scale up a pilot cast house. Then we had to modify another cast house in the UK, and then finally do a greenfield in Lafayette, Indiana to meet the supply chain requirements. So from a material perspective, it's not only technology, but the robustness you have to build into the supply chain to make sure our customers get that technology in the way they need it.
There's a lot behind it other than just inserting a new technology. You know, both you gentlemen have kind of hinted at you know, kind of the certifying bodies, and I'm curious, and Peter, I think you and I had a chat about this, on what the role is of the aviation authorities and or the OEMs, and when it comes to bringing in new technology, new materials, new processes.
It's very interesting. I would really split the industry into two parts. The new aircraft or new engine build, which is generally adopting new technology quite quickly, and where the regulatory requirements of the civil aviation authorities really don't discourage that adoption of new technology. And compare and contrast that with the perhaps replacement of obsolete or older technology when you're talking about an aircraft that might be partway through its lifespan. Even if it's a new build of an aircraft coming towards the end of that particular production run. And then it's more difficult because you're talking about recertification. It's a timely and costly process. And when you're trying to compare retaining existing technology versus the cost of adoption of new technology, quite difficult to make the decision. So I think the industry really adopts technology well in terms of new build, but struggles with the regulatory aspects of replacement.
Yeah, indeed. Dr. Moitra, you're with Spike Aerospace, and you're entering almost a new segment, right, of aircraft. I mean, how are you dealing with some of these things with respect to what you're trying to do with that aircraft, its design and manufacture?
Okay. To think about the issue that we are discussing here, I think it helps first to identify the characteristics of the industry in whose context we are talking about this. So the industry, an airplane is a very, very highly sophisticated system, a very complex system, and requires the top level of technological sophistication. Okay? Hence the need for technological innovations, and I'll talk about why or how we get that into the airplane. The next thing to consider is that safety is another paramount consideration in our industry. I mean, you are flying a bunch of people in a tube 50,000 feet up in the air sometimes. So the technology that goes into it better be mature and safe. That we need to make sure of that. It is also a traditionally low volume industry. We don't make millions of iPhones, right? We make much fewer than that. So the cost of importing technology into the process goes up relatively than in other industries. So that is something we are really very interested in at the moment, because this is what we are going to build is a supersonic business jet. It's an entirely new product. There is no such plane flying around now. So it is going to require new technology. And incorporating that into the process for producing this airplane is of really great importance to us. Okay. The airplane industry also is a very, very strongly process-driven industry, the manufacturing of it these days. So changing the process at any point, even for incorporating new technology, becomes really expensive in terms of both cost in money and time. If you miss the schedule, you're going to have losses and penalties to pay. So these are some of the things that go into considering the problem that we are talking about. That does not mean, however, that it's not happening. The industry is adopting new technology. We have had issues, but composites are a part of the airplane building technology now. So it's not that it doesn't happen, but we do need to be very careful about how we incorporate it. We need to make sure of the maturity of the technology as well as the process that makes it possible to apply it to airplanes before we can put it into the production line. Okay, so these are things we are really concerned with.
Yeah, thank you. You know, we can think about technology in this industry in a lot of different ways. There's technology in the aircraft, the engines themselves. There's the technology we use to build the products themselves, and we're going to talk a little bit about automation and 3D printing in a moment. You know, Sammy, you know, Cognite is a recently launched joint venture between Mubadala and IBM, and I'm curious because you're bringing a different element of technology to the challenge, if you will, of driving our industry. Share with us what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you, John. Cognite represents a new era of computing we call cognitive computing, which is an application of artificial intelligence. What we have, all people in industry have realized over the past many years that the amount of information that is bombarding us as decision makers in any field, in any sector, has exceeded the capacity of human comprehension, and an assistant is needed to go through that data and make decisions. Case in point, and I want to go actually back to your first question around the adoption of technology in this particular industry, because we see a lot of interest from this industry, so kind of it goes against the thesis that this industry is slow in adopting technology. If you look at the typical manufacturer, an OEM, and aggregates probably hundreds of thousands of pieces, devices, units, composite from Strata and others, that come from maybe thousands of different providers, different legal entities, different companies. Each one of them has its own specifications, its own logs, its own blogs, a lot of information. For the manufacturer, whether it's in the auto industry or in the aerospace and aircraft industry, the ability to see across all that data and comprehend it is, in my view, priceless. And the view of many of our customers that we see now appreciating this technology is priceless. Cognitive computing is able to go through that data, read it, and understand it like you and I, and summarize it for you. So imagine your ability to have one composite aggregation of all your providers' specifications in one place, and being able to interrogate it and ask questions. Whether it is in making decisions as you release a product into the marketplace, or if there is a grounded aircraft or a recall in case of an automaker, to get to quickly to answer the question of why did that happen. So aside from saving lives, which is the most important piece here, you're saving millions of dollars in getting to the answer question quickly. So when we speak to decision makers, we always start with a question: what is the cost of not knowing as you make your decision? The cost of not knowing in many cases is very, very high, especially when human life is at stake. And cognitive computing is the beginning of an era where artificial intelligence and machine will help you make better decisions and minimize the not knowing piece.
Yeah, very, very different take on technology.
I would add to that. I mean, I think your point is well taken. I mean, the complexity. I mean, you talked about the complexity at the OEM. Maybe from a materials perspective, I'll take it down one level. And our business today, that's really changing, if not by the month, certainly by the quarter in terms of big data. And I don't think we're into cognitive computing yet, but is our investment casting for engine airfoil business. I mean, we do 5 million airfoils a year. There's hundreds of process steps for each single crystal investment cast airfoil. The quality requirements for a rotating component like that are, you know, among the highest in the industry. Just our data retention alone, I mean, it's little known, but Alcoa was either the single largest or among the top 5 consumers of X-ray film in the United States, just to maintain the quality for every single one of those airfoils. And that's completely changed with digital X-ray. But we've taken that to the next step where we're making input and output decisions and process decisions in that plant today that's making those 5 million airfoils with that level of quality, with that level of complexity, only possible with big data. And I think we're just at the beginning of that. And I think that that's really going to make a very big difference in manufacturing.
But just to add, I think what you're hitting on also is that when we're talking about being innovative towards this industry, it's like we said, the perception of what's visible and seen, and what you're describing there. I mean, these are real engineering feats, what we pull off every single day to build the complex products that are flying around. So this is, I would say, the hidden part of the iceberg. another part I would want to throw out there is when we're talking about the adoption of technologies, and we talked about composites quickly. So composites has been around for a long, long time, but there's also another back end to that that drives how quickly we can incorporate or integrate. It's the skills, it's the knowledge, it's the competencies to go with it, because what you might have done at the very beginning with composites in a very small team with very high skilled and high level of experts, when you want to propagate that out to a large mass usage, you need a skilled workforce that understands how to apply it, how to utilize it, how to make the design, how to exploit it completely. So this is also part of the curve. You know, we can do something quickly today with data and analytics, but when's the real tipping point going to be? And it's going to be when we have it commonplace, and then we're not going to be sitting here saying, well, where's the new innovation? We'll be talking about something else.
If I may just comment on back to your first question, John, and probably it supports the point that Kurt's just made. This industry is in fact one of the fastest adopter of cognitive computing. We see in significant interest, and we have multiple customers now in that space, recognizing the power of this technology and the transformative nature of it. So that's behind the scene. You don't see it. You don't see a new plane. You don't see a new car. But there is a lot of, in my view, from my experience, a lot of technology fast technology adoption behind the scene.
Indeed. Let me switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about automation. You know, we had one of the things the panel was supposed to talk about is the impact of automation, to what extent will next generation aerospace programs leverage automation. And you know, I look at production rates, and some programs are going to be increasing something around 30%, you know, at the top end. It certainly seems it's hard to imagine being able to do kind of more with just the same resources that we have deployed today. And I'm curious, Curtis, with Airbus having identified automated techniques as being a key to being able to achieve what you're trying to do at Airbus by 2020, you know, what your thought is on automation, its role, where you see the biggest impact in manufacturing and assembly.
Yeah, so the first one I have to start by saying is when we speak about automation, we're not just talking about robots, right? I mean, robots is a part of automation. And yes, they do have their role and they do have their place in the production processes. And we utilize them. We've utilized them for many years also in building aircraft, and we're looking to exploit and increase the amount that we have in place. But this is, I would say, the standard part of automation. And then you can get into the collaborative part. So we're also, how can this automation and or robotics be done in a collaborative mode alongside our workers? And these are things we're working on today to test and develop. But then there's the automation around the workforce itself, the worker. And I would say this is the more core and fundamental part where we're focused, is what can we provide to them to do their job quicker, better, faster, using analytic type concepts in a dynamic way in the day-to-day business, to have, you know, quick, like you were saying about X-ray, I mean, these types of innovative techniques that come out, how can we apply them with our worker and with our workforce? And this is where we see the big productivity gains possible, because when you mention the controls, every step of the aerospace process in building an aircraft, there's quality control, and there is repetitive control and checks and steps. So automation down to the worker level in a closed loop feedback type way is something that we're quite intensively working on. We have a number of things we're testing today with regards to that. Not anymore also in the lab environment, but also in the real production setup.
I think it's important to recognize as well that automation is one of the solutions for the skills shortage. You know, there is a genuine skills shortage in many of the Western economies with the type of people who are involved in aerospace, manufacturing, etc. And quite frankly, the education systems are not producing at the rate that's necessary to match the growth in the industry. So automation is really a necessity as well as a benefit.
Yeah, I think the one challenge, I mean, we face after that, is, you know, I kind of referred to it earlier, is the type of skills and competencies as we move into such systems, it changes, it evolves.
Of course.
Yeah, so we are able to solve one challenge and maybe the skill level of the workforce, and we can adapt for that in one way. But then we require a completely different skill set behind the scenes to help them to be able to, you know, so you're in you're kind of in this looped system. You're still going to have to address the issue, but maybe from a different angle.
Yes, I agree. It's certainly very important to recognise that that does change in that way, that the skill level is a different skill level. But the totality of skilled resources required in terms of numbers does diminish as you're moving in that direction.
You know, Peter, now that you bring it up, I mean, you know, Naismith Group actually does both, you know, precision manufacturing for components of this industry. You also have a services arm that
We
provides
do.
services too. So you're in an interesting, unique kind of position to be able to comment on some of this stuff.
It's an unusual combination to have that portion of the business. Certainly what we find in terms of adopting technology, of course, that's the machining and manufacturing and so on and so forth. In the services area, though, there is a different type of technology being adopted in terms of not just automation, but record-keeping systems, the sort of information that maintains drawing standards and so on and so forth. So you're actually automating the business in a different sort of way, and you're maintaining standards in a different sort of way as well.
Yep, indeed.
If I can just add, from Strata's perspective, John, we started off with introducing products that were hand layup, relied a lot on human intervention and hours. Our vision is to move towards more technology, and I certainly think that the industry will move towards more reliance on automation and less on people. Currently, if you look today, if you consider the fabrication side of things, there's already a fair amount of automation in there. Where there is a less amount of it is probably in the assembly area, and I think going forward we'll see more automation in the assembly side of things. One important thing, though, that I would like to mention is the industry at some point would have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And what I mean by that is, with automation, you'd expect a drop in cost in terms of labour costs. You'd expect drop in scrap rate, concession rates, rework, etc. However, at the same time, there'll be an increase in cost in terms of depreciation would go up, maintenance of equipment would be higher, and you could also argue that the cost of capital increases. So that exercise would have to happen at some point to see cost versus benefit. What's the outcome? Saying that, though, I think there's enough evidence in the industry to show that we expect the benefits to outweigh the costs.
Indeed. You know, Accenture regularly does, you know, industry research on various topics, including technology and its role. And our most recent research, 72% of the aerospace executives we talked to said they viewed that the future worker in the aerospace industry was going to be more highly prized for flexibility and be able to adapt and deal with new technologies. And I'm assuming that we're talking about the technologies in the product and maybe the manufacturer assemble the product, how we access technology itself. To Peter and Sammy, your comments. What's your view on workforce implications of all the things we've been talking here on technology and automation?
Let me start with that. So at the macro level, we all, I think nobody will debate what we call the first machine age, which is the invention of the steam engine. When the steam engine was invented, we multiplied our mechanical, we multiplied our muscles. And that changed economies, GDPs globally shifted up a couple of notches, and employment obviously changed. As Curtis said, employment will need to evolve. We need to go to a higher value chain in terms of the function. The second machine age, based on my favorite economist, is the artificial intelligence age, where you're now multiplying your brain, you're multiplying your intelligence. And cognitive computing brings that era in. Now we are able, with these machine learning, to execute some functions that were deemed until very recently only human functions. And there are many practical examples. Case in point, the X-ray example that was mentioned in terms of detecting defects in aircrafts. Machines now can review these images and make a judgment whether there is a defect or not. Not based on a codified code that was written, but based on many millions of these images and learning like you and I learn. So reality is cognitive computing or machine learning or artificial intelligence is going to enhance efficiency, productivity, substantially enhance decision-maker capacity, and will impact the workforce. Workforce would have to go up to on the value chain. A lot of the simpler decisions will be eventually outsourced to an artificial intelligence machinery. And I will close with what we are 100% certain of is that any decision maker over the coming few years will need to have an artificial intelligence behind to assist them making decisions. Otherwise, the cost of making a decision will be too high.
Okay. Dr. Moitra, I was curious, when you look at what you're doing at Spike Aerospace, what's your view on the impact on the workforce?
Well, on the topic of automation, let me just get this out. I found it very interesting yesterday during the opening talks where the Boeing representative mentioned that on the Boeing shop floor, many things that used to be done by hand several decades ago are still done by hand. And that was my very strong impression the first time I walked on the Boeing shop floor. Because it seems that the elementary pieces of work at the very micro level, those are very hard to automate, because putting on a fasteners and some rivets and making wire bundles, those are still done largely by hand. So that was very interesting to me. It's not clear to me why that is, but it does look like at that level, things that are done are very hard to automate. Okay. So I think there should be scope for automation at those levels, and I think that can have a very large effect on production of aircraft. I'm not sure what is being done about it, but I think there's definitely a scope for addressing things at that level. For the airplane that we are planning to build, well, the volume is not going to be that great at first to really benefit very much from automated processes. But what can be done, we plan for it to be mostly a composite airplane. And so many other things like riveting and things are probably not going to be as labor intensive as it would be for other airplanes, where I guess people like Amer could help us putting together the technology. So, let's see. So, but still, I think humans working with their hands in building an airplane is still going to be a very large part of the production process for still some time to come. At least
I agree, actually. And there's different reasons. I mean, we can look back at why is there still a lot of manual effort in building aircraft? But I mean, these aircraft, the other thing we have to remember is some of them have been designed many, many years ago. So what works. After that, could it be automated? Yes, possibly. Then it's back to the cost and the cost intensity of doing such activities into converting them into an automated task, and is it worthwhile to do that? And then even after you've done it, is it worthwhile, and or how do you manage the upgrade and the evolution of that system? But as what we see is that more and more the technology in the aircraft that we're building today, we're not going towards a Model T Ford type scenario where there's a demand for more and more performance and more advanced product. And that also is one of those factors that humans are the best skilled and best workforce and have the work capacity and dexterity to manage this diversity versus anything. And this is not existing anywhere else at the moment. Maybe it will be in 50 years from now, we don't know. But today and in a few years to come, so this is also why we've looked from our side, how can we augment them? How can we provide them to be even more efficient? Because they will be well beyond what we could do with a robot system or setup. Not to mention after that, you have the problem when we think of typical robots. Typical robots, what we know of them today from the industry standards is it's a 1 or 2 ton piece of machinery, which works very well alone, on its own, in a cell. And if you have the mix of the two worlds on an aircraft assembly level, how do you put those big robots in around people? That's a very complicated question, and it's not an easy one to answer without some very complicated logistical problems in the flow of your production to answer.
Well, now we get to that direction. Let's maybe go to the third thing we're going to explore today, which is really additive manufacturing, or I'll just use 3D printing. And Curtis, I'll just hand that right back to you. I mean, there's over 1,000 3D printed parts on the 350. At least I read that somewhere. I assume that's a correct number. And I'm just curious, with 3D printing, there's so much said about it. I mean, are these parts being treated like any other part in terms of how they're being distributed, how you stage them for spares, and tell us about how you're dealing with those.
Well, what I can say is, I mean, we're at the beginning, right? I mean, even if, imagine we said 1,000. 1,000 out of a million some components on an aircraft. This is peanuts, it's tiny, right? I mean, in terms of scale and magnitude, we're not talking about a mass explosion of printed parts. And is there potential in this domain? Yes, and there is, when we come back to the complexity, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of it. Can it manage complexity, but be simple? And simple when I mean production simple, that it's not difficult to manage the production steps, the production processes. So we're in the very beginning phase, I would say, and there's many different reasons, and one of them, the other one, it's always a little bit of a misconception, and it's much more on the metal side than it is on the plastic. When you print a metal part in a metal bracket today, that's just one little step in a long list of steps that you have to go through to ensure that part and that product can go on an aircraft. There is many, many steps that happen afterwards. So it's not this concept, today at least, that I design a part, I print it, I can put it on an airplane. No, it's not working like that. And if we're to get to that level, it means we're going to have to resolve a number of complicated issues, either in post-treatment process steps, whether it's compaction of the material to avoid porosity because we have fatigue issues. You have to remember, these aircraft are going to fly for, like we said, 30, 40 years, 20 years. So whatever the quality of that part is, we have to be able to ensure its consistency from day one. And these are the challenges I think the industry is addressing, and that's just one of, I mean, and I'm sure you can allude to a number also on the material side, and the supplying of material, I mean, is another simple one. If you take powder, there is no large, massive scale if we had thousands and thousands of parts on every aircraft. There is no supply chain set up today to supply that powder and that material in a quality-controlled fashion.
No, I absolutely couldn't agree with you more from a materials standpoint. So I kind of take a three-phased approach to considering this. One is, yeah, we've done it. I mean, your point about the mid-1980s, yeah, I mean, Alcoa has been doing 3D printing for prototyping for 20 years at our Houghton casting facility. It's great, it's prototypes. But we got to get beyond that. So the question is, how do we get beyond that? And, you know, Chris, your point is exactly taken on the powder side. I mean, our investment right now is in our R&D center, is in powder. Because you have to understand the input material to 3D printing. And once you do, and if you can scale it up to reach the ramp rates and the rates you want, that's when you're going to see some true success in the 3D printed part. I mean, it's just like my example back to the aluminum lithium cast house. You have to connect from a material perspective and a quality supplier at high ramp rates. You have to connect all the dots, and so we're doing that. But we also believe 3D printing is not about, you know, just the finished part after 3D printing. Your point about it being part of a system is absolutely true. I think one of the most fascinating things we did about 6 months ago was bring to the market a concept called AmpliForge. So we now 3D print a preform for large forging and eliminate all of the upfront steps. We hit that part once. And by the way, the kit we use is in a plant in Cleveland, Ohio that was built in 1970. So we've matched 3D printing into a very traditional process. But at the end, you're much more efficient, you get the properties you need, and maybe that's your simple but elegant example of how you can marry the two. And we think that is an area rich for more exploitation and development.
Yeah. Peter, I'm curious, I mean, is this an example of where the civil aviation authorities and how the process and regulation in our industry works will slow things down? Because certainly there's other examples of where 3D printing has been used to take cycle times down from 14 months, so satellite propellant tanks down to a couple months. I mean, so the examples are there. Is this a case where those civil aviation authorities will get in the way?
It's very interesting. I think the adoption of a technique like 3D printing is one which moves swiftly in the right applications, but moves very slowly in the wrong applications, or ones which are perhaps less benefiting from it. If you were talking about 3D printing where you want a high variety, you want development product, for example, and you want to be able to modify designs and constantly update, etc., then it works well. And often you don't have the certification issues that go alongside full stream, long-term manufacturing. So that's quite interesting from that point of view, and I think 3D printing has a particularly good place there. You'd think there was a good area of activity for 3D printing when you come to legacy products, for example. Certainly, you know, it's the area where the drawings have been lost and the items have to be produced in some form, and certainly the original tooling and so on perhaps is missing, and 3D printing could lend itself very well to it. But because it's a technique change, the regulatory requirements, which are very important because of the safety aspects of flying, the regulatory requirements do actually prevent you using something which would be potentially an extremely valuable tool. So I think the industry has to continue to develop. You would ask the question of the civil aviation authorities, are they being overly restrictive with some of these techniques? I have a personal view, which is that they're not, because I wouldn't like to fly in an aircraft which has had releases granted for trivial reasons. But there is a question mark that needs to be asked there in terms of whether those civil aviation authorities can relax rules to some degree, and if so, what levels of testing are then still required for these products, because they are advanced technology, they do have risk, they haven't been proven in the field for 30 years. Is it the right way to go forwards?
Just to add one thing, I mean, all of these topics and what I said before, I mean, we are actively working heavily in the background. It's again one of those things, the visible part or the hidden part. There is intense amount of effort being put into how we can exploit and figure out how to exploit this in an industrial way. And certification is a heavy and a very important part of doing that. The materials is another very big and important part of that. Working with the machine manufacturers who provide the equipment to bring them to the proper standard and code is another fundamental part of that. What we said at the beginning with regards to skills and competencies is another huge aspect of having to put in place something to bring it to an industrial scale. If you want to have the full exploitation of a new technology and a capability like this, you need a combination of many, many things to happen. And you need a combination of many industries and many different types of businesses working together in a very collaborative way, I would say, to make such a thing happen quickly.
So it sounds like instead of saying that we're slow to adopt these technologies, right, we're very considered in how and when we adopt these technologies so that we can make sure that we retain that reputation for safety that we've earned in this industry. Would that be a good way to summarize?
I think that summarises it very well. I think we are very considered. We are safety conscious continually, and I think that's how it should be. It's interesting to compare it with the Formula One industry, which is pushing leading edges of technology in similar ways, often with small quantities, but doesn't have the same regulatory requirements or the same safety requirements ultimately, because it's down to the safety requirements of the individual Formula One teams. So it's a very interesting comparison there with industries which are probably at similar levels of technology and advancement and have the opportunity to adopt the latest in both cases.
Yeah. Amir, Strata supplies to programs across Airbus, Boeing, and a few other firms. I mean, have you looked at this technology? Do you see a role for 3D printing in your operations?
It's certainly on the roadmap for us to look at, because we see additive manufacturing and 3D technology being the future. Personally, from my perspective, I think the jury is still out in terms of have we identified enough material properties to sort of meet the requirements of high stress for the aircraft parts, and I think the jury's still out to answer that question. But at the end of the day, it's definitely on the roadmap for Strata. Today, we see additive manufacturing used in plastics. I still think there's a way to go for metal. But I'd just like to go back to a comment we were talking about in terms of the certification process, and I agree with the comment made over here. The question is, should there be a shortcut, or should there be a more efficient process? I personally don't think there should. We've got enough lessons learned in the past. If you look at the widespread review of composite today, we'll go back to the 70s when it was first introduced. It went through a very rigorous testing and qualification process, and the outcome of that is we see widespread use of composite today. So if any new material is to be introduced, I think it should go through the similar rigorous testing and qualification progress. Build confidence of the material, the technology first before you introduce it widespread into manufacturing processes.
Now I want to leave some time for questions. Does anybody in the audience have a question for our panel? Raise your hand and make sure you get a microphone.
Thank you. Just a question for you. I was thinking while listening to your comments about which are the impacts on the talent pool and on the organization that will impact your company in the near future. Really, the reflection is about the fact that probably in order to leverage at maximum this kind of innovation and technology, probably we have to leverage on a talent pool that is adequate, but also to change a little bit our process in the organization in order to tackle this innovation wave more effectively. Which are your thoughts on that?
I guess from if we first jump from the 3D printing one, I mean, so for sure there's, in terms of talent pool, what's the best way to get an upskilled resource pool with regards to such a technology? This one's probably an easier one, at least on our side, in terms of the application, because we have thousands of very, very highly skilled engineers, and they know a lot about materials. They know a lot about the different processes. We mentioned composites. Composites is an additive manufacturing process. We're laying out material layer by layer. So we know a lot about the capabilities of these types of things. So this one, it's how do we then give them the new tool set through learning and by doing, and actually some of them are learning by going through the rigorous processes and all of the different steps when we try to figure out how to apply. So they're learning by applying, and then we're seeing how we can scale from that. If we go into the automation domain, we see a similar thing. It requires, I would say, the workforce to start to adapt also. So as we're implementing the new systems, there's also processes we put in place to upskill the teams and the people to manage and deal with those systems. This is the part, I guess, is the easy part. The more complicated part is how do you get the universities, the schools, the education system also to steer in the same way. And that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. But then things like have been talked about in the past couple of days, the partnerships and the relationships that we build, not just between industry, but also to universities, the research bodies and so forth, are also an integral part of preparing the future for those new and innovative technologies. And this is where the collaboration has to come together much more. If we want to go faster, it's also one of the key enablers.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think from our perspective, there's always going to be a man-machine interface. It's hard for me to see a completely automated process inside our system. I think we're going to see degrees of automation being introduced to the system, and I think what's even more interesting is different decision-making processes for the management level, and I'm talking the management level on the shop floor. So you've got a couple of things going on. You have different inputs to the decision process. I mean, we're making real-time decision process today in that Howmet facility, for example. But that's a totally different skill set for that plant manager to adopt. And the good news is that we've got great people that are doing that. But going forward, on the one hand, you're not going to have to, you can't ignore the fundamental manufacturing process that we're going to do that may look pretty traditional. But that's going to have bolt-ons. It's going to have different decision aids, different data inputs, and that's going to change how that part of that individual's job gets done. And so I think your point earlier about having, a very adaptive, learning-oriented workforce is so important. I mean, we don't want to turn over our workforce. I mean, we have employees that spend decades with us, and we want that. We just want adaptable employees that over those decades are going to be able to, take in these new technologies as they fit into existing processes.
And evolve with the organization.
And evolve with the organization. I mean, that's the most healthy way to do it, and I think it's completely doable.
I think I agree with both of you. This is the quality of talent is a topic that transcends particular industry, and especially when innovation matters, and innovation matters today than 5 years ago, and will matter a lot more tomorrow. And innovation is not just in technology, innovation is in business model, innovation in multiple aspects of how you conduct your business. In a new field like cognitive computing and artificial intelligence, a cultural change has to occur, and new way of thinking and addressing problems has to happen. And in our industry, the pool is even tighter in terms of who are those trained on cognitive computing who can help transform a company or an industry with a new line of thinking. So a critical topic continues to be more critical. Innovation pace is increasing, and companies who have, through every economic cycle, you look at companies that have survived those economic cycles, tend to be the companies with a high concentration of high quality, innovative workforce.
It's a good question. Other questions? Okay, then let me get to the last topic that we had on the agenda for this panel, which was really other industries that we look for kind of ideas for our industry. And Sammy, actually, I promised I wouldn't do this, and now I'm going to go back on that promise. You mentioned that the aerospace and defense is one of the primary industries that you're working with right now. What other industries are you working with?
The manufacturing in general, aerospace in particular, is an industry that has shown a lot of appetite for this decision support technology. For obvious reasons, lives are at stake when you are flying at 40,000 feet, as my colleagues mentioned. We have a lot of interest from the financial sector. We have a lot of interest from government services. But I think the prime interest and the prime investment that IBM made in this industry, with this cognitive computing, is in the healthcare space. One of our most mature products is in the cancer treatment, oncology advisor. And this technology is capable of assisting oncologists across the world in protocols and treatments methods that the best cancer doctor in the world that trained the machine would think through. So here's an opportunity for us to take the expertise of world-class oncologists and scale that expertise digitally across the planet and assist other oncologists to make decisions of the same quality. For obvious reasons, we chose healthcare and oncology particularly to start because it has a significant impact on humanity. But also, if you look at the United States, there is significant waste in the healthcare sector in general, and there's a lot of opportunity to create commercial value. But that example is an example that we see being duplicated elsewhere. Expertise are being digitized through these cognitive machines, whether it's a doctor or a teacher, which we have enormous need for teachers across the world in the education ecosystem to go and teach in Africa and India where you cannot reach. It's transformative. It will change the way we not only make decisions, but the way we educate.
So when it comes to intelligent automation, you can draw from a number of industries outside of just aerospace or manufacturing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've had the question since I think you brought it up yesterday in the session.
You did.
It's been going through my head, and I'm trying to think of an industry that we're not looking at, because it's the other way around. We're looking across many different industries to see what can be plugged and played, and I think this is the biggest part of what we can do going forward to move quicker, to move faster, because whether it's developing a new aircraft and having this very, very massive, large-scale collaboration across the globe to make it happen, the value and the speed is in how we're able to bridge and how we're able to make that interaction and communication and those linkages that something from the medical industry could be applied in the aerospace sector. And I think this ties very well back to what you said at the beginning. Who knew Velcro and other things would spin out of a space program and other things? I mean, so our way forward is if we're able to see those things quicker and faster and actually be able to make that bridge and that link from a people perspective, really, I think it's much more on the people, then we're able to adopt faster.
I think we've got to look at where we are. Aerospace is a leading technology industry. That's the reality of life, and we're sitting here and comparing and contrasting with others. There are some others which are comparable, but few. Around the world, aerospace is one of the leaders, and people look to aerospace to give them the lead, as much as aerospace looks to others to help contribute to it.
Indeed. All right, well, I notice we're at the end of our panel here. I want to thank all of you for engaging conversation. I appreciate your time, and thank you everybody for your attention today. And have a great rest of your stay here in lovely Abu Dhabi.